Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial. Tutorial's the right word, really. But this is my kind of top 10 Romeo and Juliet quotes, ones that I'm sure that you can do really good stuff with in your exam. So let's just have a look at these. Okay, so I've tried to go through these in chronological order. And first one I've chosen is actually from Lord Capulet when he's talking to Paris. Paris has obviously approached Lord Capulet around marrying Juliet, but actually Lord Capulet at this point says, "My child is yet a stranger in the world." It's a great quote. Shortly after that, we learn she's not even 14. And clearly you can do some contextual stuff around differing attitudes to marriage, to gender, the position of women. You can do a bit of bits and pieces there, and certainly bringing in that idea of the patriarchal society, this idea of it being a fairly transactional situation between the suitor, in this case Paris, and the father, who has real input on that, and really very little choice from the women. Okay, in terms of sort of deconstructing the language here, I think that metaphor of stranger is interesting. Here he's referring to that sense of her being innocent and naive, and the world here representative of experience, associated maturity. And, he feels that she's too young for this. And yet, interestingly enough, within a very short space of time, he's quite keen to get her married off. We get that possessive phrase, "my child," as well. And I think that just what I was mentioning there about that juxtaposition between this caring parental behaviour and the later, much more brutal behaviour that we see from him. Okay, my next quote I've chosen is Act 1, Scene 5, and it's that first sighting of Juliet. "Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, I never saw true beauty till this night." It's got dramatic significance. It's got sort of character and relationship significance. But I like that idea of the rhetorical question, really showing he's sort of interrogating and reflecting on his own feelings. And perhaps there's that realization that the feelings he had for Rosalind before were not they were not true, they were not sincere, whereas this is this kind of light bulb moment for him. And again, with that noun phrase, true beauty, Juliet to him is the embodiment of real beauty. But I think comes with that idea of he's always captivated by what he can see. And we can talk there about modern notions of love. It's less about, we less buy into this trope of love at first sight. Now it's about people and the connections we have with them and personalities. So we can definitely do some stuff there. We can also think about, this doesn't necessarily reflect very well on Romeo, because he was obsessed with Rosalind, it seemed, and by implication, if Juliet is true beauty, then Rosalind was not. I've just realised annoyingly that I've forgotten to number this correctly, so this is actually number 2, but it says 1. Oh, but that we do go to 3. Okay, next, still in Act 1, Scene 5. I like these quotes. It's cheating a bit because I've put 2 on here, but Tybalt responds to Lord Capulet saying, chill out. Tybalt has this very immediate and aggressive reaction to seeing Romeo is at the party. And these quotes are really interesting. That declarative sentence type of "I'll not endure, I won't put up with him," it confirms what we read or heard about him in Act 1, Scene 1, when he's described as fiery, and he's utterly enraged, and this is obviously setting up that later conflict with Tybalt, who seems to typify that impetuous and somewhat toxic masculinity we see in the play. And in that second quote, I think the conjunction's important there. "I will withdraw, but this intrusion shall convert to bitter gall." I will stand back for now, but there's a sense of we're anticipating repercussions, vengeance for this. And there's also an interesting point there about the use of the bitter gall meaning poison, and obviously that is how Romeo dies. So there's some interesting ideas around foreshadowing particular events. Also in Act 1, Scene 5, really crucial scene, is Juliet's response to when she learns of Romeo's surname. And I think they've got a few things here. We've got those images of newness like sprung and birth, and that's this awakening, and really reflective of this idea she's moving from childlike innocence into womanhood, a woman, a young woman with feelings, with emotions, with this newfound love. That we've got, interestingly, structurally, that parallelism of my only love, my only hate, and it just reiterates that conflict and contrast between those emotions. I like the idea of the modal verb must, indicating that she almost feels like she's compelled, almost against her wishes, and that sense of the loathed enemy, really reminding us of that conflict between the families. Okay, shifting on to Mercutio during his kind of death speech, when he sort of says a plague on both your houses, and obviously that plague image is repeated 3, if not 4 times during this part of the scene. Plague evokes those images from the Bible of these biblical punishments, and they also they evoke images of sort of widespread suffering and death to entire communities, which is reflective of, with these families, that the fallout, the consequences of their actions have much wider spread suffering. And I think it's poignant and thought-provoking that Mercutio is very much Romeo's friend, and yet that curse, that plague, is on both of the houses. Everyone is to blame. So I think that's a really interesting quote. When she hears about Tybalt's death, and she hears that Romeo is the cause of this, she reacts in a really emotional way, as we might expect, devastated. I think this quote is really interesting. It actually really reminds me of Macbeth, actually, for those of you who do study that. But here we've got this sense of appearance versus reality, and we've got that biblical allusion to the serpent. Serpent is something tempting, but ultimately is the embodiment of the devil. It's evil, and that's juxtaposed with the idea of a flowering face. So really, this sense she's in a sense of distress here, because Romeo seems to be one thing, but he appears to be one thing, but the evidence would suggest he's not that great underneath, because he could kill her cousin. And we also get that oxymoron within this same sequence of the beautiful tyrant, and we see that kind of conflict. Act 3, Scene 4 and 3, Scene 5, again, cheating a bit in that I've put 2 Capulet quotes together. I think they're important to look at them together. When Paris, is talking again about wanting to marry her, and he's then telling his daughter of this decision. He has previously talked to her about as a child, an innocent, but here he's much more dominant and much more, he's very committed to the idea of her marrying Paris. That verb ruled, we can think about and explore that idea of his authority as her father and as a man in that patriarchal society. And, by extension, she then is sort of submissive and inferior. And then that second one, where he really sort of has an aggressive, abusive sort of attack on his daughter, when he, that thing of my fingers itch, really that metaphor hinting at his desire to hit his daughter, is hard to see. And there's lots of interesting things to talk about here in terms of Juliet and her, and the way she's sort of victimized by a number of people in her life, really. Okay, my next quote, not necessarily, these quotes aren't necessarily the biggie or expected ones, but they're useful ones, I think, to talk about. Here we see her preparing to take the sleeping potion, and it's just this sort of sense of how alone and terrified she is, and she refers, using the noun phrase dismal scene, to the moment in her life that she's in. But equally, that sense that Shakespeare is actually consciously bringing in the language of theatre and performance, use of the word scene and act, which reminds us as audience it is a dramatic construct and draws attention to the artifice here. Right. 9, Act 4, Scene 5, Capulet's discovery of his daughter, as he thinks at this point being dead. And, this is poignant and in some ways quite emotive, and our sympathies would be with Capulet, but so recently he's been highly sort of abusive and brutal to her, viewing her as a curse, wishing she hadn't been born, threatening to disown her. In terms of technique, we've got this idea of the metaphor, and she represents his family, his legacy, his lineage, and now without her to carry on that sort of family, well, not she wouldn't carry on the family name, but without her carrying on that lineage, he feels the futility and hopelessness of life. And I think that interesting return to my child, something he did in Act 1, reminds us of that he is a loving parent despite how we might respond as modern audiences. And then finally, I've chosen a quote from Act 5, Scene 1. I like this. He, just before he gets the news that Juliet is dead, he talks about this dream that he's had. And this is the second time he's had this sort of prophetic and foreboding moment. In Act 1, Scene 5, if you remember, as he goes to the Capulet party, he feels this, he has this fear of something out there, this sort of untimely death. And it's almost like, again, he's accurately seeing the future. And it fits into this sort of trope of this idea the Elizabethans had about fate and destiny, reinforces the eponymous heroes as tragic characters, this sort of inevitable thing that was always there going to happen. And obviously it foreshadows and preempts his return home, where Juliet does indeed find him dead. So useful for questions, I've missed that off here, but useful for any questions about death, about Romeo, about their relationship, or the idea of tragedy. Okay, so I hope that little sort of those sort of explanation of those quotes was useful, and that they might come in handy for you in your exam. Best of luck.